So I'm browsing BDGest, France's IMDb for comics, and on their best manga list, I see something surprising. Above the usual suspects like Berserk, Akira, One Piece, and Akira in Black and White is a comic I've never read called A Distant Neighborhood. At number 5, just below 20th Century Boys and Akira, is something called Summit of the Gods by the same author. So maybe it's just me, I think. Some random blind spot in my comic knowledge. It happens to all of us. So I go to America's My Anime list, and I see that A Distant Neighborhood doesn't even rank in the top 800 most popular manga in America. Summit of the Gods is outside the top 1,000. And then I find out it's not just America where this author, Jiro Taniguchi, isn't super popular, it's Japan too. Here's a BuzzFeed Japan article basically saying, why the heck is this guy so popular in France? Well, it turns out Jiro Taniguchi is more than just a little popular in France. He's a perennial bestseller. France's top comic critic has written a whole book about him. Guys, the French freaking knighted him. What's going on here? Well, to find out, I bought virtually all of his books I could find in English, read that French book about him, and went through a ton of interviews across 3 languages. And what I found really surprised me. It turns out the French know something the rest of us don't, because Jiro Taniguchi rules, but in a very surprising way. And I simply couldn't pass up the opportunity to mispronounce both French and Japanese names in a single video. So let me tell you all about the unbelievable story of Jiro Taniguchi. The year is 1982. Jiro Taniguchi is 35 years old, and he thinks he is about to die. He lies on his back in his tiny apartment, staring at the ceiling, trying to will himself back to sleep. But his heart won't stop racing. It beats faster and faster. Taniguchi's day-to-day life is a strain. He's a manga artist, but not a super popular one, so he has to maintain an insane pace just to make ends meet. He is illustrating multiple ongoing series, producing about 120 pages every single month. He works from the same tiny room he's sleeping in, barely 100 square feet total, with as many as 5 assistants at a time. He works 12 hours every day of the week, except deadline day, when he works 24 hours straight. His only free time is spent going out to bars with the writers and editors of his manga. They'll go out drinking until 7 or 8 in the morning, and when the writers and editors finally go home to sleep, Taniguchi goes back to drawing. These days, he can't even remember what he's drawing. All he thinks about is deadlines. Even in his dreams, he counts and recounts pages, making sure he has enough. And it's not like the money justifies it. He has to pay his assistants out of his own pocket, and some months there's nothing left over, and some months he has to even dip into his own savings. To keep afloat and pay their salaries, he's been taking on more and more work, but that's only putting him further into this endless spiral. He had hoped that his last big series, Lindo 3, would be the one that finally put him on the map, that would get printed as a book and earn him some royalties, but the book was a flop, and his situation had only gotten worse. As he stared up at his ceiling, his heart racing, he must have wondered, how did I end up here? It had been his lifelong dream to become a manga artist, but after 16 years in the industry, his dream was killing him. Taniguchi could always draw. Even as a kid, when his family couldn't afford paper, he would draw on advertising leaflets or on the backs of magazines, anything he could find. At school, the other kids would crowd around him and watch him at work, but the teachers didn't like his drawings. Why? Because the only thing Taniguchi drew was manga. He loved manga. This was the late 50s, so of course he was obsessed with Osamu Tezuka, but as he grew up he witnessed the birth of the Gekiga Revolution, a comic movement that was trying to shrug off Tezuka's legacy and create complex, mature, and challenging comics. He toyed with the idea of becoming a manga artist and even began to work on a manga to submit to a competition, but he never finished. His strongest desire was just to escape his small town and move to a big city, so he took the first office job he could and got to Kyoto at 18 years old and never looked back. But the manga bug didn't leave him. After 8 months of office work, a friend told him about a manga artist, Kyoto Ishikawa, who was looking for an assistant. He would soon find out why Ishikawa had a hard time holding on to his assistants, but for now he went to Tokyo to meet with him. Ishikawa demanded that Taniguchi demonstrate his skills, so Taniguchi quickly turned out a 20-page story and sent it to Ishikawa. Ishikawa liked it, and so, at 18 years old, Taniguchi got his first job in the manga industry. But it wasn't exactly as glamorous as he was expecting. Most of his job consisted of drawing the lines around the panel borders and applying whiteout where he was directed. At least that was when Ishikawa wasn't having him change his kids' diapers or take them to the doctor. And to top it off, the pay was pretty meager. But still, even though he was nearly broke, even though his job wasn't that exciting, he was living in the big city and making money working on manga. Over the years, he was given more responsibility, if not that much more money. And after 6 painful years of working as an assistant, he was ready to strike out on his own. But Taniguchi had a problem. He didn't fit in. See, the manga industry was once again in the midst of an evolution, and Taniguchi couldn't find his place in it. This was the early 1970s, and the Gekiga revolution that had begun in the late 50s had completely changed the face of manga. Taniguchi had been blown away by the boundary-pushing work of artists like Yoshiharu Suge, Kazuhiko Miyaya, and the other artists of the alternative manga magazine Garo. These were works that were surreal, violent, and boundary-pushing. Speaking of, if you guys would watch a Suge or Garo episode, please let me know. It'd be a lot of fun to make one. Taniguchi wanted to be published in Garo, yet he submitted piece after piece, and every time he was rejected. You can see in this early work he's very much aping Suge's style, but really, just as he didn't fit in with mainstream manga, he didn't fit in with the Garo crowd either. It was becoming clear that Taniguchi's interests had taken him away from the world of manga, and those interests would soon have a profound impact on his life. And it all started with a used magazine. A friend of Taniguchi's was a subscriber to the European graphic design magazine Graphis, and in 1973, Graphis put out a special issue on comics. Taniguchi's friend brought the magazine over, and as he flipped through it, he came across this page. He knew immediately that this was it. This single image from a French cowboy comic called Blueberry changed everything for Taniguchi. It was like nothing he'd ever seen before in manga. After some work, he tracked down the publisher in France and mail-ordered a copy of the book. It was expensive, and the copy he received was old and beat up, but he treasured it. This artist, Jiro, was drawing things that Taniguchi had never seen. Here's what Taniguchi said about Blueberry. There was so much information in each panel. I found framings that no manga artist had yet attempted, complex, surprising page compositions, and a very strong sense of realism. He soon found his way to an imported bookshop in Tokyo, which carried more European comics. It was also there where he found Heavy Metal Magazine, the American version of France's Metal Hurlant magazine. Within those pages, he discovered the artist Moebius, and he became obsessed. One day, he found an entire book of Moebius's illustrations. I was so impressed, my heart was pounding. Then he made another shocking discovery. Jiro and Moebius were the same person. And yes, I'm working on a Moebius episode, so this is your reminder to subscribe and turn on the bell notifications so you don't miss it. Taniguchi continued exploring the world of European comics. Micheluzzi, Giardino, Tito, the way these artists laid out pages, their focus on realism, the time they spent developing their backgrounds and their settings. Unfortunately, no one else in Japan seemed to share Taniguchi's weird obsession with European comics. He himself didn't even speak French, he just loved reading the stories visually. Now, sometimes at his publisher's parties, he'd run into another young artist, 6 years younger than he was, with whom he could geek out about Moebius. That young artist's name was Katsuhiro Otomo, but that's a story for another day. Professionally, Taniguchi's love of European comics was leaving him in a rut. After failing to get any of his original manga published, he ended up working on a children's adaptation of one of the stories he'd assisted on, but soon had to accept the fact that he wasn't going to make it on his own, and began once again looking for work as an assistant. He was hired by Kazuo Kamimura and began warming up his diaper-changing skills before realizing that this was a very different kind of atmosphere. Kamimura's environment was more professional, and Taniguchi got to spend more time drawing backgrounds than frame borders. Kamimura was part of a new movement in manga, of seinen manga. Mainstream manga works aimed at older male audiences, but without the devotion to realism and transgressiveness of the earlier Gekiga movement. And Kamimura, like Taniguchi, believed in the power of backgrounds and their importance to storytelling. Kamimura was open to ideas from European comics, and in his massive collection of books in his studio, he even had some by European artists like Krapex that Taniguchi loved to flip through. Encouraged by this development of seinen manga, after a few years with Kamimura, Taniguchi thought it was time to once again set out on his own. But again, it ended in disappointment. His stories were still getting rejected by publishers. So he did what any reasonable artist would do and started making porn. Okay, he got a job working for an erotic manga magazine. Even if that wasn't really his thing, he was still getting paid to draw his own manga, and that was his dream. At this point, he mostly just wanted to draw peaceful stories about animals, and so his publisher would let him draw his little animal comics as long as he threw in a few scenes of eroticism or violence. Soon, his editors realized that he had potential. His animal stories were just a little gentle for their readership. They realized what Taniguchi needed was a writer. And so they introduced him to Natsuo Sekikawa, a 28-year-old journalist who'd spent his whole career writing for and editing erotic magazines. They hoped that Sekikawa could bring out Taniguchi's more action-oriented side and create something to take advantage of the wave of violent, pulpy manga sweeping the nation. This partnership would change both men's lives, just not right away. They started by creating violent, action-oriented comics about animals. Soon, they moved on to the more straight-ahead, hard-boiled action style that was popular in the late 70s. But Taniguchi wouldn't drop his love of European comics and brought that love of backgrounds and heavy shadows into this work with Sekikawa. When Sekikawa went to Europe on a trip, Taniguchi begged him to bring back copies of Metal Hurlant. Sekikawa didn't see the appeal, but Taniguchi was obsessed with studying the European language of comic storytelling. He even convinced Sekikawa to write a story that took place in France, and another in which a character is a Metal Hurlant writer mixed up with the Yakuza. Now, none of these works were huge hits, As Taniguchi's acknowledged, because manga was published in magazine format, they always needed filler stories to fit between the big hit series, and Sekikawa and Taniguchi were happy to provide them. But this is also the period in which Taniguchi's workload spiral was increasing. To get more work, he began working with a second scriptwriter, Caribou Marley, another hard-boiled writer who would go on to write the Old Boy manga in the 90s. Now, Sekikawa and Taniguchi had hoped that their collaboration Lindo 3 would be a breakthrough, but it was a flop. Then they put all their work into Trouble Is My Business, where Taniguchi brought even more of his European influences to bear. This one actually had a warm reception, but their publisher went bankrupt after only 4 volumes. And so, the jobs kept piling up, Taniguchi kept on taking more work, and we arrive at that fateful night, with Taniguchi's heart racing, lying awake in the middle of the night, convinced that this was the end. He finally got out of bed and went to the doctor. It wasn't a heart attack, it wasn't an ulcer, it was Taniguchi's lifestyle that was killing him. The doctor was adamant. It was time for something to change. Slowly, Taniguchi began cutting back on his workload. He wrote his own story, Blanco, about a dog that was a decent-sized hit. Of course, it was still an action series about a genetically modified dog being hunted by the military, but hey, it was more personal work and he got to use photos of his own dog for it. Sekikawa, for his part, had gotten tired of the constrained demands of writing violent, hard-boiled manga and had quit the industry to return to journalism. But the publisher still wanted more from him. Sekikawa said he'd only do a new series for them if he could do something set in the Meiji era, and that he could do everything that theoretically could not be done in manga. To get Sekikawa back, the editor agreed, and so Sekikawa wrote the script for The Times of Bachan. When Taniguchi saw this script, he was blown away. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen. He was used to gritty, dark action manga, but this was a serene piece about an author working on what would become one of the classics of Japanese literature. It featured many historical characters and a well-researched depiction of the era. There were no guns, violence, or eroticism. For Taniguchi, this was both exciting and intimidating. He would have to push himself and his art to the next level to make this kind of work engaging for readers. He knew his job was to bring this world to life. He did tons of research, building a library of photos and paintings of the Meiji era. With his new, slower pace, he was able to take time working on the setting and the costume designs. He pushed himself to use new drawing techniques, avoiding his usual large areas of flat black, and instead trying to give everything this luminous quality. The slower pace also allowed him and Sekikawa more time to work together, going back and forth over the pages together rather than just drawing them as quickly as they came in. In the end, instead of Sekikawa taking a writing credit and Taniguchi taking an art credit, they would together share a co-creator credit. Now, neither of them believed that The Times of Bachan would be a hit. It was a last hurrah for Sekikawa in the manga industry, big middle finger to the rules of storytelling that frustrated him so much, and for Taniguchi it was a personal challenge to demonstrate the new techniques and his unusual influences. And then it came out. Against all the odds, the public embraced it. Finally, after years of trying to cater to audiences and publishers that demanded hard-boiled action stories, these two men had stepped back from the industry, slowed down, broken all the rules, and created a serene, peaceful work that resonated with people across Japan. The Times of Bachan would run through the rest of the 80s, and it developed a devoted following. Taniguchi still might not be a household name in the manga world, but after 21 years in the manga industry, his unique style was finally being embraced by a portion of the public. But, as it turned out, Bachan was really just the first step on his journey. The success of The Times of Bachan began to open other doors for Taniguchi. Publishers were taking notice of this gentle, serene approach of manga he was pioneering. And the new editor of Morning Magazine, Yasumitsu Tsutsumi, was looking for boundary-pushing manga. He'd seen the serenity in Taniguchi's work and wanted to hire him to do something even more relaxed. He contacted Taniguchi and proposed that he do a manga on the theme of walking, something inspired by the films of Yasuhiro Ozu. Taniguchi liked the idea and so began work on The Walking Man. At this point, Yoshihiro Suge, Taniguchi's old influence, was making similar slice-of-life manga, and Taniguchi's first version of The Walking Man was a bit too close to Suge's version for Tatsumi's taste, and he turned it down. So Taniguchi tried again, focusing more on his own interest, and as he worked, Tsutsumi would continue to push him to go to further extremes, eliminating more words, eliminating the narration entirely. Now, if you're sitting there going, wow, this sounds like the most boring comic ever, I'm not going to argue with you. If you like things like plot and character, that's your choice. But I love The Walking Man. Here's a comic made by a man who had for years pushed himself to the brink of death through overwork, making a simple story about the joy of walking around your town. He had spent 15 years working non-stop, and I think only someone with that experience could depict with so much tenderness the simple joy of taking your dog out for a walk. The way he constructs this book is absolutely unique. Taniguchi brings all of that love of drawing backgrounds, of luminously rendering things in screen tone to celebrate the world around us. If most mangas are prose, this is a work of poetry. There's a way on each page Taniguchi will combine 4 or 5 images: a facial expression, a landscape, a foot, a close close-up and convey so much more than is contained in those images. Art can do so many things for us, but so rarely does it encourage us to slow down, to appreciate the little things. This is a work that challenges the very idea that stories require conflict to function, and it makes a pretty convincing argument. I really recommend it to everyone, if only just to get a taste of how varied this medium can be, but especially if you're like me and like the films of Ozu or like Wim Wenders' Perfect Days. I'll put links down below where you can purchase all of these books, including on Walt's comic shop for those of you in Europe, where you can get 10% off your first order with my referral code. But as much as I like it, The Walking Man was not a huge hit with Morning's readers. Perhaps Taniguchi and Satsumi had pushed the minimalism a bit too far. But Morning was about to have another big impact on Taniguchi's life. This was the beginning of the 90s, and Morning was interested in getting into the Western comic market. They decided to send a delegation of manga artists and editors to France's big Ayakuweb comic festival, and knowing Taniguchi's obsession with French comics, selected him to be part of the delegation. That's right, after 40 years without ever leaving Japan, the country's leading French comic geek was finally going to get his chance to go to France. They even asked him for a list of artists he'd like to meet, and when he was there, he got to meet his heroes. Mobius, Tito, Giornito, Jodorowsky, none of his comics had been translated into French, but he gave them all copies of his work in Japanese. Then he got to tour Paris, both the museums and, of course, the comic book shops, where he loaded up on French and American comics. And Morning was there because they were looking to do more collaborations between French and Japanese publishers. Satsumi and the Morning team were meeting with Casterman, France's leading comic publisher, about bringing some of their comics to the French market. And one of the comics they decided on was The Walking Man. The Walking Man was released in France in 1995. It wasn't a bestseller, it sold about what it had in Japan, but certain critics in France took notice. This wasn't like anything else the French public had ever seen. It wasn't what the West at that time considered to be stereotypical manga, but it certainly wasn't the densely plotted and carefully painted French comics either. There wasn't really anything like this coming out of America in the 90s either. People who really knew their stuff took notice, but that was just the beginning. After the failure of The Walking Man Japan, Taniguchi returned to hard-boiled stories. He illustrated a new series called Bankai in New York, and even pulled Sekikawa out of retirement to finish off Trouble's My Business, drawing on even more European influences to do so. But despite all this work on crime comics, he still found time for another one of his peaceful stories. This one a simple short story about a couple whose dog is getting older, called Keeping a Dog. And this one struck a nerve in Japan, even winning an award for Best Short Story. If you want to see all of Taniguchi's lyrical storytelling power distilled into 40 or so pages, this is it. This success opened the door for another of his quieter works, A Journal of My Father. This time, Taniguchi fuses his love of setting and relaxed pacing with a bit more plot, for those of you classless slobs who like that sort of thing. In it, a young man returns to his hometown for his father's funeral after many years of living away in Tokyo. It mixes memories, reminiscences, and discoveries, exploring childhood and nostalgia with the same careful eye for detail from The Walking Man. The characters in it feel so real, and the place so lived in, that even this low-key plot becomes incredibly engaging, without losing any of the quiet power of The Walking Man. And you can see Taniguchi both developing his style and continuing to work against manga traditions. He's spoken about the tendency in manga to exaggerate facial expressions, to heighten every emotion to make it clear to the reader. But Taniguchi purposefully goes in the opposite direction, trying to capture the subtleties of facial expressions, our tendency to mask our true feelings. It's incredibly effective, especially in this kind of story. As you can tell, this is another book I strongly recommend. After Journal of My Father, Taniguchi's publisher requested him work as an artist for a new series they developed, The Solitary Gourmet. In a way, it feels like a riff on The Walking Man, about a man who visits different restaurants and enjoys different meals. The publisher thought Taniguchi was the perfect artist for it, and I have to say, I think they were right. Taniguchi continues to push his visual language forward, exploring new ways to use screen tones and shadows to depict food. And yeah, this kind of feels like a return to his erotic work. I mean, just look at these images. The Solitary Gourmet is arguably Taniguchi's most well-known work in Japan, having been turned into 2 TV shows. Thankfully, it's finally getting a proper English language release later this year, and I for one already have it pre-ordered. But as good as The Solitary Gourmet was received, Taniguchi didn't write it, only drew it. Finally, he'd return as both writer and artist for A Distant Neighborhood, the work that would change his life. A Distant Neighborhood continues on that trend from The Walking Man and A Journal of My Father, a quiet work that's as concerned with place as it is with people. But here, Taniguchi adds a dose of high concept that takes everything to the next level. In it, a 48-year-old office worker, wandering in a drunken haze, wakes up to find himself back in time to when he was 14 years old again. He's back in his hometown, in his old life, the summer before his father disappeared forever. This small, mystical dimension empowers the whole work. That sense of enjoying the small things in life from The Walking Man, the sense of nostalgia for the past of Journal of My Father, take on a heightened dimension through this premise. Because now the character's walking around, but in a place that doesn't exist anymore, with people who aren't around anymore, and it gives all of his techniques he's developing even more power. The way Taniguchi pushes himself, his facial expressions, to depict this 14-year-old who has the wisdom and regret of a 48-year-old is truly remarkable. You can feel the joy for his young vitality, as well as the sadness for all the things he's lost. The book is funny, insightful, nostalgic, and melancholic all at once. It's a really special work, and while it was a moderate hit in Japan, soon after, the French got a hold of it, and it became a sensation. Not only did it become a bestseller in France, but at the 2003 Ayakuweb Festival, it won the award for best writing, the first manga ever to do so. Taniguchi himself said, "When I received the prize, I felt an emotion I'd never felt before. It was so incredible to receive this recognition in France, for someone who had always worked in Japan, but had been interested in French comics for so long. I was happier to be recognized in Europe than in Japan." The book continued to be a sensation in France. A Belgian filmmaker would even change the setting and turn it into a French language movie. So why did this book do so well in France and throughout Europe? In part, I think it's because of the maturity of French comic culture. There's a large variety of comics produced in France, and like in Japan, they're read by people of all ages. But the culture of French comics is generally around albums, hardcover books of beautiful art that are meant to be cherished and reread. So while in Japan, Taniguchi's work might have struggled to find its place in magazines and weekly installments, the French were able to approach his work with no preconceived notions. It was presented as a serious work, not cut up into pieces in anthology magazines. And of course, this was an author who had obsessed from afar over French comic culture. In a sense, he was a man deeply connected to this distant land, and I think the people of that country must have recognized, across language and cultural differences, a kindred spirit. At 56 years old, he had finally found his people. The success of A Distant Neighborhood sparked a surge of interest in Taniguchi's older works throughout France. French readers rediscovered The Walking Man and Journal of My Father, and they became bestsellers too. But Taniguchi wasn't done challenging himself. As much as these serene stories are what he's known for, he still loves action. He followed up with The Summit of the Gods, a 5-volume series about extreme mountaineering. Here, Taniguchi turns his ability to create breathtaking settings to the tallest mountains in the world. Instead of men enjoying their environment, it's the story of men desperate to conquer their environment. It's a great work, very different from the other stuff, and yet again it was a huge hit in France. Taniguchi's success would allow him to continue to experiment and follow his passions. He would create more walking works, like Furari, which is basically The Walking Man in Edo-era Japan, as well as A Zoo in Winter, the semi-autobiographical tale of a manga artist's assistant. He was always pushing himself forward, like in Venice, a fully painted work, always trying out new techniques, whether it was for his writing, his storytelling, or his painting. In interviews, he talked about wanting to try his hand at a shonen manga, or finally try and make his own science fiction series like Metal or Lawn. Sadly, in 2015, he fell ill and had to again reduce his work pace. He focused his work on the fully painted book The Light Year Forest, but passed away after only 20 pages were completed. Jiro Taniguchi was a man who almost lost his life to overwork, but he managed to survive and chose to spend the rest of his life making works that remind us again and again to slow down and enjoy the time you have, because every moment, like life itself, is fleeting. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you haven't already checked out Jiro Taniguchi's work, I have links and a reading guide down below. For those of you in Europe, I'll have links to Walt's comic shop where you can get 10% off with my referral code MATTTT. Be sure to like, subscribe, and comment. It truly does help this video. Thanks to Ayakuweb for help on the translation, and thank you for watching. I'll see you soon.